Good evening, everybody. It's quite daunting to have such a large audience. As David said that he didn't believe me, I am not an expert on vernacular buildings. I want to stress that at the beginning, so maybe half of you will disappear straight away. I inhabit a box that's called landscape archaeology, which I'm sure you know what that involves. We dig and look at earthworks and the landscape, and don't just sort of focus on little things, but focus on the wider landscape and put things into a wider context. But one branch of archaeology that's, I suppose, fairly recent in the scheme of things is the archaeology of standing buildings. I'm not sure how vernacular historians like all you look upon that archaeology sort of coming into your sphere. I don't know, but I'm a landscape archaeologist. The reason I'm giving this talk rather than somebody else, I'll come on to in a few moments, and the slide there, that building there, I'm going to come back to that later as well. A little bit of historical context for buildings in the Settle area, or the Ingleborough area. I don't know how many of you have come across this booklet by Gordon Sanderson, published in 1911. It's about 60 pages long. It's A4 format. And of the 60 pages, all but 3.5 are on houses and halls, and the 3.5 are on barns. And the only barn in the area I'm talking about is this one near Stainforth. I mean, I think for 1911, it's pretty good, but if you can read the annotations on there, the only thing he's annotated is whether it's slate or wood, or he's got down the bottom stone edging. Why does he have stone? What kind of stone was it? But he says nothing about the features there, like the granary, the voussoirs in the cart arch, the roof. But I'll just read out a little bit from the preface of his book. He said it was intended to act as a guide to those interested in architecture, and also to show how much is owed to the yeoman builders of long ago for introducing a local style of their own. And that's what vernacular architecture is, isn't it? A local style all of their own. Now, as far as I know, this is the earliest relevant publication in the Dales, I think. Moving on, somebody you mustn't have heard of or read Kate Mason's work. I think she did some wonderful work in sort of Addingham and different parts of Craven. I think she can definitely be called a pioneer. And also another one that I greatly regard is Arnold Pacey, who has done work for the study group in the past. He can't be active at the moment, but he has been in the past. But the person who I am most indebted to is Alison Armstrong. I'm sure many of you, well, I know many of you know her. That's her with her usual cheeky smile. I'm not exactly a disinterested commentator, because since 2011 or 2012 we've been, as they say, an item, but she has taught me an awful lot, and we've worked together on landscapes and buildings, well, since before. We met in 2007, so we've got quite a long history of looking at landscapes and buildings together. And I just love her drawings, just a few examples there on the left, particularly one at the bottom, the 3D view of the shippon. Now, I don't know where many of you come from. I gave a talk once some years ago, and I kept using this word shippon. And about halfway through, a hand went up in the audience, and I said, yes. And he says, what's a shippon? And I was a bit stunned. I thought, how can anybody not know what a shippon is? So I said, well, where do you live? And he said, oh, I live somewhere Wakefield way. I said, a mistle. And then, a mistle, right. So shippon, byre, cowhouse, as they call them in Swaledale, mistle. there we are. So Alison Armstrong, she's unfortunately ill and is unable to be present tonight. The three things I want to focus on that we've worked together on in this area. In 2011-2012, the National Park Authority ran what they call the traditional farm building census. Then I want to move on to a tree ring dating program that was under the umbrella of Stories in Stone, which was the, sort of the trading name, as it were, of the Ingleborough Landscape Partnership. And then the third thing is a survey that the two of us did of a barn at Newby Cote, which is, if you don't know it, is between Clapham and Ingleton. Rather nice, but that was the barn in my title shot. We did a level 3 survey to Historic England's level 3 detail. So those are the three ways I want to structure the talk. So we'll start with the TFB census. But going back before that, this is a map produced by the National Park Authority of Swaledale and Arkengarthdale, and each of those black blobs is, well, it says barn. Now, I don't know whether they are all barns or whether they included other buildings as well, like helms or hog houses or whatever. And I also don't know whether they were just located in the field or in the field and from historic mapping. But that was a sort of starting point for the national park. But putting that into a historical context, go back to 1975, and I found when I first came across this, I found it absolutely staggering. In the North Pennines, there was a report done on landscape and landscape features. And regarding traditional farm buildings, shorthand barns, they described many of them as eyesores with no cultural significance. How on earth they could have said that, I do not know. But the report came up with 4 possible scenarios for the future for these barns in the North Pennines. Get rid of them, convert them to holiday use, just let them decay, or offer grants to secure the long-term future. 2 years later, the National Park Authority did a report on its barns and came to the conclusion that number 4 there was the way to go, because I mean, many of the barns in this area are outstanding. Well, not just this area, they are outstanding in different ways, aesthetically, historically, in terms of landscape value. So the National Park from 1977 accepted the fact that barns are very important, and as far as possible and where suitable must be preserved. And then 10 years after that, the MAF, Ministry of Agriculture, etc., introduced the Environmentally Sensitive Areas Scheme under that 1986 Act. And the ESA scheme said walls and field barns should be highly valued, and quite rightly so. And it's out of that 1987 ruling or diktat that came the conservation areas. And that map, which I showed you just is there again, that's the Swaledale and Arkengarthdale conservation area. And there was another conservation area in Littondale. Now, as part of that, the National Park Authority did a use and condition survey in both of those. Where's that? Go away, you. Okay. In those 2 conservation areas, and within the Swaledale and Arkengarthdale, on that map I've just shown you, there were 1,442 traditional farm buildings. Barns, as probably most of them, and the figures break down there. So 72% were out in the field, only 10% were in villages or hamlets. And from that 1,442, they estimated that across the whole of the original national park, before the extension, that there were probably something like 4,500 to 6,000 barns in various states of whatever. And the figure there at the bottom, from this, 55% were perceived to be in good condition, which means that 45% weren't. But what they meant by good condition, who knows? But out of those, however many there are, 4,500 to 6,000, only 15 were listed. So around Ingleborough, back in 2011, for a long time, I was chairman of the local archaeology group based in Ingleton, and I volunteered the membership to survey all the TFBs around Ingleborough. And those are the numbers of TFBs that we identified in each parish. And that is from field evidence and from historical mapping. They're not all standing, but that's the total number. Something like, getting on for about 400, just over 400. I volunteered the membership to do it, but I was very much hoist with my own petard, whatever the saying is, because I found it difficult to get volunteers to come forward. Many of them, understandably said, they didn't feel that they had the technical ability, or they weren't able to interpret barns. So I ended up, for my sins, doing the whole of Horton and half of Ingleton. Alison took on Stainforth and Landcliffe, and somebody else did Clapham and Ostwick. So some of the parishes across the national park it was all done by volunteers, but some of the parishes, the surveyors, quote unquote, just sort of took photos and made notes from the nearest public right of way. But I made sure that we did these surveys to level 2 standard and got permission where necessary to go and look at barns. And there was only one farmer in the whole of those 6 parishes who said, go away, which is very nice. So in out of that lot around Ingleborough, 35% we classified as excellent or good, 15% fair, 21% just gone or in ruins. So if you add the excellent, good and fair together, you get 50%, which isn't far off the National Park's 55% estimate earlier. But then it's still pretty subjective. And as an example, how would you classify that? Would you say that was fair, poor, under threat? I mean, the walls are okay, apart from a little bit at the top on the right, but the roof, I took this picture, well, it would have been in 2011, and more of the roof has gone. And we all know what happens when part of the roof goes. But that's a very small, very simple, very plain, very functional 2-door barn, the shippon door on the left and the door leading into the hay mew on the right. And the lintels there, you can see they're not nicely carved. It's very much a vernacular building. The survey we did around Ingleborough, we were looking at, well, classifying barns into type, into plan form, doing basic measurements, length, width, height of walls, height of the gable, doors, forking holes, mucking out holes, etc., etc. They got on the top a 2-door gable entry barn with a little mucking out window, mucking out hole, and an owl hole at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of throughs going across. And if you look below the lowest line of throughs, just about level with the left-hand closed part of the door, the masonry below that is very different from the masonry above it. So whether it was rebuilt in part or in total, don't know. And then the barn on the right with the rather cockeye steps there leading up to a granary. So we were looking at features like that. What did these barns contain other than just, the shippon and the mew? And 2 other buildings there, the one at the top with an added porch, rather a grand building, probably quite late, 19th century I would imagine, but a very fine building, built to last, in perfect condition. One on the right there, It's got a door at the ground level, an opening now gridded off, some steps going up the gable, and another entry above the steps in the gable there. And I'm sure many of you will know it instantly what that building was used for. And there's a clue in the bottom right of the picture, purely by chance. The chickens decided to pose for this photo. That's a hennery piggery. So the pigs were downstairs and the hens were upstairs. And the aperture there was for feeding the pigs. This one was restored some years ago, but there are quite a few in Craven, North Craven. And then what you don't see very often, and you certainly don't see very often at all, is what you've got on the left there, that columbarium, the dovecote in the barn. And dovecotes tend to suggest 17th century. And the photo on the right is an equally rare feature. This is a barn just between Horton and Sellside. It was restored again some years ago, maybe 20 years ago, I can't remember. It was restored privately, and they put the same sandstone roofing flags back on. And if you look at the ridge line, it's not a set of sort of half-broken ridge tiles. They've actually put back the wrestlers that were there before they restored the barn. And I think that was wonderful that they put it back like that. And I don't know of another barn around here with wrestlers in that condition. And it's also nice, I think, that this barn was restored because the farmer to this day uses it for overwintering cattle. It's not just restored for the sake of restoring it, it was restored to put it back into traditional use. And we also looked at internal furniture. So you've got two examples there, the one on the top, or timber, the one on the bottom, timber framing with what the general person would call slate, but they're actually held with bridge flagstones. You've got in the timber one, you've got the piece nearest the camera, the skell boos separating the shippon from the mew. You've got the boskins where the cattle were kept. You've got in both pictures the vertical poles there, the rutsters, which have a sliding ring to tether the stock. And you've got you can't see it there, but you've got the fodder gang where the farmer went to feed them, and you've got the group where all the muck was sort of pushed out through the door, or through sometimes they have a little bottom hole to sluice it out. And the one on well, they've both got them, but you can see it on the one on the right, the timbers above the shippon, the balks above the shippon, again for storage of hay above. We looked at timbers as well, roofing timbers. On the bottom right there, nobody can fail to see that they are reused timbers. The one on the left has got one peg hole, the one on the right has got two peg holes inside a half-lap joint. Inside that particular barn, which I'm going to come back to later, there was clear evidence of a previous crook construction. The top picture there, this is something which Alison often said. I'm not sure whether she said it was unique or originated in Ribblesdale, and it's that thing dropping down from the apex of the truss, the king block. And that one is a rather nicely carved king block. Some of them are quite plain, but some of them, like this one, are pretty ornately carved. What function they served, presumably purely aesthetic. If that's not correct, then somebody can tell me later, please. The top left picture there, to the left of the red and white pole, is a padstone, which, for a crook, again from a crook built building. Two padstones I found in that barn, but there's an awful lot of muck, so there may be more. Graffiti also in several barns. The one on the right there, it's a timber on the skelboos in a particular barn. It's got 4 sets of initials and dates carved into it, but the figure there is certainly a lot older than the mid-19th century. And I wonder whether whoever did that, presumably a farm worker, in the barn looking after the cattle, or just, I don't know, having his dinner or something or whatever, whether that was his satire on his boss, on the farmer that he was working for. But he's got a wig with a, whatever they call it, sticking out the back there with a ribbon on, his long clay pipe and his rather ample belly. It's a strange expression on his face. And the one at the bottom there, which many of you, I'm sure you've seen this drawing before, it's on a huge piece of Helwith Bridge flagstone forming the skelboos, and etched into it in the top right part of the drawing, there's a whole set of dates and initials from different periods. There's that star bottom right, there's the daisy wheel to the left of that, and then there is that ship, a full rigged, full sail ship. Now, whoever etched that obviously spent a long time doing it, but to my mind, he, and it must have been a he, clearly worked on a ship, and maybe on that ship. He clearly must have been a mariner. Now, this is near Ribble Head. And you might think, well, what on earth would a mariner be doing at Ribble Head? Well, I've got a copy of a will dated, I think it's 1659, of a man who lived in Ingleton, and the will makes it clear that he was a mariner. It names the 2 ships that he served on, and he was leaving his worldly possessions to his named mates on the 2 ships he'd worked on. So that's a link there between Upper Ribblesdale and the ocean. And there's another barn in that complex which has a ship on one of the doors, etched into one of the doors. Date stones, another thing we looked at. The top one there, 1675, is not in situ, been taken from an earlier building. The one at the bottom there, 1843, with the initials of the family. It's rather an ornate barn. You can just see from the voussoirs there, they're very nicely carved, as is the date stone. It's making a statement. And then reuse. Both of these shots are taken on buildings that are now barns, farmstead barns, but clearly the one at the top there, you've got 3 light mullioned window there, that was the barn that originally was a house. And the one on the bottom there with a rather, get the cursor on it, this rather well carved, looks like a lintel, not in position, but you've got in this fantastic lintel, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 halberds in this wonderful, whatever you call this, it's scrolling, I don't know, but a rather nice doorhead. This is on a barn, but that barn clearly started its life as a house. And this is another barn that's seen a lot of changes. The cursor there, you've got a blocked-in window there. And with an eye of faith, you might be able to recognize, if you follow the cursor, sort of rectangular thing there. There's another one at the bottom, but it's not clear. But there and there are 2 fireplaces, and this fireplace here is on that wall there, and there's another one upstairs. So that's presumably a fire window. There's a 3 light mullion window here, blocked in with a string course. There's a change in masonry going down there. There's a change in masonry across there, and there's a change in masonry across there. So it's a house that's been modified several times, been turned into a barn, And this is I didn't say at the beginning, but under stories in stone, 10 barns were selected on using various criteria, were selected for consolidation, and this was one of them. So that barn has been fully consolidated. It's going to be there for another few hundred years. And this is the building that had the 2 reused timbers I showed you earlier. A typical Ribblesdale L-shaped barn with the shipping extension on the left, forking hole. There's a splayed slit vent there. There's a blocked in splayed slit vent there. And there's a blocked in splayed slit vent there. And there are some more on the back. It's got a raised roof line. It's got a block door on the back. If you follow the quoins, come here, mouse. If you follow the quoins up from the bottom here, get to that point there, and they change. And you see the same on the 2 back corners. So it's had a raised, it's been raised. And this was originally a Crook barn. That's Whernside. Over there is Whernside, by the way. That's Whernside. The farmers call it Dowbigging barn, but Dowbigging was the chap they bought the land off whenever it was, back in the 50s. But I found a document dated, I think it was 1675, and it was very clear from the document that it was talking about this barn, because it named all the fields, and the field names are still recognizable. And it was then called Overhouse. Now, house doesn't mean it was a house that we live in, cow house. So that's a rather nice barn. We wanted to get this restored. I wanted to get it dated under the tree ring dating program, but unfortunately the farmer declined. He had his reasons and he was entitled to them, but I thought it was sad that we couldn't get it dated at least. So that was the traditional farm building census. Then moving on to stories in stone, just a bit of background to it. It ran for 5 years. I was on the management board. We started off intending to do 60 projects, and we finished up delivering 170. Just over £2 million put in by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and quite a bit more put in by the 2 quarry companies that have quarries locally, and other Natural England and other stakeholders. And one of those 170 projects was, as I've said there in that paragraph, I was asked to draw up a long list of barns that I thought were worthy of renovation or consolidation on those criteria there. The landowners had to agree to cough up 10% of the capital expenditure, and they had to agree to manage it for 10 years. One, apart from the one I've just mentioned, one other landowner wasn't prepared to put the money in. But a couple of years later, he actually admitted that he shot himself in the foot and he wished he'd agreed to it. So out of the long list of barns that was drawn up, 10 were renovated and 9 were put back into use, mostly, but not entirely, in Upper Ribblesdale. And just as an aside there, another of those 170 projects was restoring dry stone walls, and 4,000 metres of dry stone wall were rebuilt. I put important there because again, they had to meet certain criteria. The historical integrity, again, the landscape value, and 1 or 2 other criteria. So I think Stories in Stone was fantastic, but again, I'm not a disinterested observer. Another project of those 170 projects was called Thorns and Abandoned Settlements, which ran for 18 months, which I was very privileged to be appointed to run. 2 vernacular buildings, agricultural buildings plus a house were consolidated, as were. We did all sorts of archaeological investigations and targeted excavation. And Alison took on the task of surveying with a group of volunteers all the 11 buildings on the estate, which were in various states from complete to just earthworks. And there's one of the buildings, a field barn with a cart bay on the right hand side as you look at the south elevation. These are Alison's drawings, elevations, the gables. There's about half of the roof on there has since collapsed, rather sadly, but at least it was fully recorded. Another building on the estate is this fantastic building. It's a bank barn. It's this type of barn is very common in Westmoreland, and it's quite common in Swaledale and Arkengarthdale, but in Craven it's extremely rare. And this is a particularly fine example. This was on my long list for restoration, but this is the one the farmer said he wasn't prepared to put the money in. But it's very sad because part of that roof has gone since. But a bank barn, you've got two gable entry doors. The other one is hidden behind that wall. Two gable entry doors into the shippon, and a cart entrance here into the hay mew. Now, the hay mew is above the shippon, so you've got a two-level barn entered from two different levels. Tagged on here is a full length, or an almost full length outshot shippon. I learned something new the other day. A friend of mine who lives in southeast Lancashire said an outshot, they call outshots down there outale, O-U-T-A-Y-L-E, an outale. I've never heard that word before. A forking hole up there. There's another building was tagged on this corner here, possibly a bull, for a bull, I don't know, or a loose box. And you can't see it here, but tagged on the end is a stable as well. So a wonderful example of a bank barn that's definitely under threat. And that's Alison's plan. Very complex building. That's the outshot shippon at the top. The shippon there entered by the two doors, this whatever it was on the corner, the cobbled cart entrance. There was another shippon at this end, but that's been stripped out, and then the stable here. And these three arrows are pointing to graffiti. This one on one of the balks, the beam supporting the balks. This one on the boskin timber top rail, and in this one there are two of the timber supporting the ceiling, the wooden ceiling, which have graffiti. Now, number one on there, above the shippon, is written on it in red ruddle, RH 1837. Now, I found the accounts for the rebuilding of that barn, 1835 to 1837, it was rebuilt, and the carpenter listed in the accounts receiving payment was Mr. Howson. So it must have been Richard or Robert. I've not been able to find him in the censuses, so I don't know whether he was a Richard or a Robert, but he was the carpenter who did all the carpentry work in that barn. The graffiti on the boskin rail in the outshot shippon is MLFL in that sort of Victorian type script, and that stands for Mercy Lambert and Francis Lambert, and they're in the census farming there in 1851. And this is Mercy. She died in 1904 in her 80s, and this is her near the end of her life. So it's wonderful to me, as a historian and a landscape archaeologist, it's wonderful to be able to link real people to dates to structures in the landscape. And the two sets of graffiti in the stable, it's written again in that sort of cursive script, the new stable. So back in the woodyard, which I think would have been in Clapham, they'd obviously stacked the timbers up and wrote on the new stable so that they wouldn't go to the wrong place. It's in red ruddle, written in red ruddle. the bank barn cost £77 to rebuild. And another barn on the estate, which was rebuilt in 1864, Backhool's barn, cost £59 in total to rebuild it. And Backhool's barn is, I think it's a very nice barn. Well, I like barns anyway, so I'm bound to. And that's Backhool's barn. This was fully consolidated under stories in stone, but this was the one that wasn't put back into agricultural use, so the farmer didn't have to pay a penny. But it was felt that it had so many features of interest that it was worth preserving. 3-door gable entry, there's no other way of getting into it. A forking hole there. This doorway here has got various sets of graffiti, photopoeic symbols. The fold yard was restored as well, and the barn was completely cleared out inside. And that's Alison's plan. And can you hear the cat meowing? Go away. Alison's plan of the barn and the roof as it was. The roof was blown off some years ago, but the timbers were still collapsed inside it. So that's there. It's on a right of way as well. And it's very prominent. If you drive up the road towards Ribblehead, you look across to the right, you can see it stands out very clearly in the landscape. And another building that was consolidated was the out office. There were four houses at Thorns, in the centre of Thorns, and this was the common out office. We took all the moss off, we cleared out all the rubble. The rubble that was either in or immediately out was put back, sort of partial rebuild. The lintel was put back, and the blue arrow there is pointing to a carved stone, which is with the carving facing inwards. So it was just put there with a flat face into the out office. And when we got it cleared out, you'd be delighted to hear we found the slate seat with a hole in it. And I was born and grew up in a house with an out office at the bottom of the garden, and going down there in the winter was no joke. And we also found under this rubble here the hatch out of which you drew the stuff. And that stone there, this is Alison's profile of it. So it's got an OG ovalo moulding with a couple of stops. So this clearly came from a building of some, is status the right word? Presumably out of a house that was taken down and it was put in here. But when we restored the building, we put it back so that the facing of it faces outwards now, so it can be seen. So moving on to the tree ring dating programme, again under Stories in Stone, Alison and I put this together and ran it. We started off with a list of 15 buildings, 8 field barns, 5 farmstead barns and 2 farmhouses. And we got Robert Howard from the Nottingham Tree Ring Lab to come up on several occasions to do coring. 3 of the buildings failed to deliver. One because all the timbers proved to be ash, annoyingly. The other 2 because, well, one of them because there weren't enough rings. There were many of the dates within barns that didn't work, mainly because either there were too few rings or the rings were too thick or whatever. But there were 2 timbers from out of those buildings that he did core and said should give dates, but he couldn't match them with anything, which was quite frustrating. But out of the 12 that for which we got dates, he took 45 cores and we got 18 different date ranges. And the results were unbelievable. just to show you where they are, each of those numbers is one of the buildings, the 15 buildings that we started off with as we surveyed. The ones that didn't work were number 11, west of Clapham there, number 3 at Low Berkwith, and number 14 at Lodge Hall. Those 3 did not provide dates, but all the rest did provide dates. So I'm just going to go through, not all of them, but the ones that were particularly interesting in my opinion. That's a summary of the date ranges that we got. So if we start on the right-hand column, out of the 45 timbers, there's the number of timbers that dated to each of those periods in the left-hand column. And the middle column shows the number of buildings that fit into each of those periods. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was reading online the draft chapter on barns of the new Northwest Archaeological Resource Assessment, and thankfully what's gone on the website has changed it, but in that draft it said that most of the barns, this is in the Northwest, right up through the Northwest, said most of the barns date from the 18th or 19th century. What a load of rubbish. So there's only one building there out of those 12, only one that fits into the late 18th and only one that fits into the late 17th. And then obviously 3 medieval and 7 in the middle. So I think the results were spectacular. This is a barn north of Ostwick. The curving wall, or the raking wall there, that's the road going up into Crummockdale. It's called Whitbeck Barn. It's got one of those Ribblesdale blocks, king blocks there, collar, tie beam in the truss. You can see how wavy the timbers are. There's Robert on his ladder drilling away. And we got 7 dates out of this. There they are. Dates from 1500 up to 1564. So that was the barn that was, you might say, rebuilt, but we found in there the rebates, the wall rebates, where crooks had sat into the wall rather than sitting on padstones. It's got a plinth, it's got a raised roof line, so those timbers, those dates refer to the building that you're looking at in that picture there. It's got no public access, I stress, but you can see it from the footpath that goes through the fields to the left of it. So that was one barn. We weren't expecting dates that early at all. A barn, again, there's no access, but you can see it from a right of way at Low Berkwith Farm, north of Horton and Ribblesdale, an L-shaped barn. This one's been consolidated as well under the Stories in Stone. You can see in the bottom picture there 3 pegs, a half lap joint, another of these king blocks, which is that one there. This is the scaffolding, tie beam, and we've got 2 dates here, both dated between 1596 and 1621. A barn near Ribble Head called Battersby, and just all the timbers are clearly old. I think they're all, from memory, I think certainly all the trusses were reused timbers, and those are the dates we got from different trusses and purlins from 1546 up to 1685. So the barn had gone through at least 1, 2, 3 periods of change, or possibly 4 periods of change and alteration, rebuild. A lot of interest in that barn. This is a barn. Wharf, if you don't know the area, is just to the east of Ostwick. It's on a right of way, this one. again, this was consolidated under stories in stone. The roof was, it was re-roofed maybe 20, 30 years ago, so all the timbers were changed, so there was nothing of interest in the roofing timbers, but the outshut shippon here had reused timbers, but the too few rings. But on the cart arch here, this lintel here, you can see it's got peg holes. This did date, and we got the date, the felling date of 1492 to 1517. Again, just did not expect to get such an early date on that. We're fairly, these barns were done over a period of months, as Robert could find the time to come up and do a few. But we just got onto a high, the three of us, very quickly. This is a barn right on the right of way that runs from Fazer westwards to Ostwick, Cat Hole Barn. Again, it's been one of the consolidated ones. It's got raised roof line, it's got slip vents, it's got block doors, it's got reused timbers, and those are the dates we got from that. So that clearly was built, rebuilt, changed in two phases, early 17th century and then 1774. But the main rebuilding and the roof that's there now dates from 1774. This is a lovely little barn. Again, not on a right of way, no public access. You can't see it from anywhere unless you actually get into the field to see it. It's quite small. It's on two levels, the shippon down there, the shippon door down there, and the mew door there. But it's not a bank barn because it's built into the limestone bedrock. So this is the floor of the shippon. That's the back wall of the shippon, and this is stone revetting of the mew. It's just solid rock behind that. Reused timbers, peg holes, pegs there, half lap jointing in there with a peg hole with a peg in it. And we got 7 dates out of here, 5, 1516 to 41, and then 2, 1533 to 58. But because those dates overlap, possibly all those timbers were felled at the same time, somewhere between 1516 and 1558. So again, we just did not expect to get such early dates out of that. And this is the barn, that's Alison acting as a scale bar. It's just south of Brackenbottom. It's close to a road, but there's no access into the field. And if you look at that barn, as we did, Alison and I did when we first looked at it, we thought, 18th century, early 19th century, standard barn, shippon on the left, cart arch entrance into the mew, no sign of raised roof line. It just looked like a standard barn with its fold yard in front, and there's a little stream running across there, a fold yard, so the cattle could be let out to have a drink in winter. And we got 8 dates. 1 date from a purlin, which felling date 1504 to 1529. The other 7 dates came from 7 different timbers, and the dates, the felling date singular for those 7 timbers was 1259. Unbelievable. Doesn't mean that that building was built in 1259. Obviously it wasn't, but the timbers, most of the timbers date back. And I know it's known that if in the past, if you had good building timbers, particularly oak, you did not let them go. You passed them down from father to son if they were not actually in a building, because they were valuable things. So on that site, or very near that site, there was a building built way back then. And this is one of Robert's photos This is on one of the principal rafters on one of the trusses, and you've got to turn yourself almost upside down. It's drawn in red ruddle, and there's carpenter's marks there, the 2 there, so that's truss number 2. So they knew where to put it. But this drawing, that's the apex of the roof, that's the floor of the barn. Timber, 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 and then other timbers there. That is a drawing of a box frame building. And again, if any of you are from South East Lancashire and don't know what box frame means, down there they call it post and petrol. Something else I didn't know until a few weeks ago. So those 7 timbers were presumably part of that box frame building. Now, the question is, did the carpenter draw that to show his fellow workmen what they were creating back in the yard? Because clearly it wasn't done in situ, because he wouldn't have done it upside down if it was in situ. But it's just absolutely amazing. I keep saying that, don't I? Very quickly, Alison used to say that there was doubt about the dating generally of half lap joints and notched lap joints, but we got some dates there. So for the half lap joints, 2 from Stubbing Barn dated to about 1600, 3 from Beckdale 1259, and 1 from Springford early to mid 16th century. So half lap joints, they've got a long span of use. Notched lap joints, unfortunately those in 2 barns just didn't date, but we got 3 out of a barn at Clapdale, late 16th century. And again, Alison used to say that nobody was really sure when those king blocks, those Ribblesdale king blocks, were in use. Stubbing Barn had 4, but infuriating that none of them would date. The rings were just, there were too few rings. But Whitbeck had 1 that dated to, again, the mid 16th century. So, you know, I hope those dates add something to the, you know, the understanding of half laps, notched laps, and king blocks more generally. And the third thing I'll do this very quickly, I'm conscious of the time. This barn at Newby Cote, west of Clapham, it's obviously a very big barn. There's a clear change in the masonry along that line there, along here. There's a difference in the masonry in this last bay from the rest of it. There are 1, 2, 3 lines, 3 rows of splayed slit vents, cart entrance, stable door there. Inside there are wall rebates for crook timbers. There are 2, from memory, 2 padstones, crook padstones. There are blocked apertures on the back wall, and all the timbers except the truss at the far right hand end of the building, they're all reused timbers. And damn it, every single timber was ash, so couldn't date it. We became very unpopular, did Alison and I, with the estate that owns this, because they wanted to get planning permission to convert it into holiday housing. And we were commissioned to do a full level 3 survey of this barn. And we found so much of historical interest. We did this in 2019, early 2019, March 2019. They've still not been able to start work because the National Park said, aha. That's the plan of the barn. So it's truss 1 at the right hand end, that's a modern truss, all the rest are reused. P stands for padstone, R stands for rebate, the crook rebate, block window there, block cart door there, stable here, with a Jacob's ladder still in situ in that corner. And these slit vents on back and front. And this gable, the south gable, is visible from the road that passes by. and it's got this wonderful shadow of the original crook gable wall. Fantastic barn. And that's my last slide, apart from the inevitable. If you want to read any more about the tree ring dating program or about all the work at that thorn settlement, I'm sure the YDMT, Yorkshire Days Millennium Trust, will be very happy to have their palms greased. Thank you very much indeed.